So let's take a look together at some of the sampling methods we might use. Let's say I have 40 students in my statistics class. 20 are men, 20 are women. I want to talk to about half of them. I flip a coin to determine who to survey, and if I get heads, I'm going to survey the 10 men, and tails, I'm going to survey the 20 women. Sorry, that should have been 20 men and 20 women. So since each student is equally likely to be chosen, it is considered a random sample, but is this representative of the population? No, because I'm either talking to all men or to all women, and as we know, men and women often have differing opinions, so this would not be a good sampling method to use. So our goal, as we look through the sampling methods that I'm going to show you, is to pick the method that will minimize bias and represent the population as best as possible. The simple random sample. This one is great. It's the easiest one, obviously. Simple's right there in the title, and typically it works really well. So in a simple random sample, every combination is equally likely to be selected, and a lot of statistical theory is based on the SRS, the simple random sample. So how would it work in our statistics class? If I assign numbers to each student, 1 through 40, then I use a computer to randomly generate 20 numbers, then I'll have a simple random sample that is representative of the population. So same idea as before. But now, it's not going to be all men or all women, it's just going to be half the class randomly selected. This brings us to another method called stratified sampling. So SRS is great, but sometimes we want to make sure that a certain characteristic of the population is represented proportionately in our sample. So that could include income level or gender or race or age, etc. And basically this reduces bias since the amounts are proportionate. So if I have a certain number of men or women or a certain number of white versus minority, etc., and I want to make sure that those percentages stay the same in my sample, then I would use stratified sampling. So here's an example. I have 200 students in class with 140 men and 60 women, and I want to survey 20 individuals. How many of each would I sample? So notice here I would find men as a percentage, which is 70% men, 30% women, and when I find how many out of 20, I'm just taking 20 times those percentages to find 14 men and 6 women. So in this case, it might be a good idea to stratify if I wanted to make sure that I had proportionate amounts of men and women. Another method is called cluster sampling, and a lot of people get cluster and stratified confused, but cluster sampling has nothing to do with any characteristic at all. It's just another way to find a random sample. So in this method, it basically splits the population into clusters. So it splits them into groups. It randomly selects a group or groups and then takes a census of all of the subjects in that cluster, which means it talks to everybody in that group. So the benefit is it can be less expensive and take less time. And you can be sure that everyone responds if you're looking at a smaller subgroup and actually talking to them personally. So example, I wish to find a representative survey of an on-campus BU students. We could use each residential course, so each course that meets on campus, as a cluster. I could randomly select certain classes. So let's say my MA 215 T101 class, which is typically a class I teach, might be one of the classes. If this class were chosen and say whatever other classes, everybody in these classes would be talked to. But say people in my MA 215 T301 class wouldn't be talked to unless that was one of the classes chosen. Systematic sampling is another method, And in this method, we're just taking every nth individual. So every 5th individual, every 10th individual, every 100th individual that we come across will be surveyed. It's easy and cost effective, but again, make sure that you're not choosing it in such a way that you're going to introduce some sort of bias to your survey. So surveying every 10th person in line at the cafeteria about student fees or tuition would be a good way to use systematic sampling. If I instead surveyed every 10th person in line at the cafeteria about the quality of food at the cafeteria, that would be biased because, again, people are in line at the cafeteria. They probably don't think the food is too bad or they wouldn't be there. And then we have multi-stage sampling, and this one is not used very often for your purposes in the real world. I'm sure it is used more often, but for your purposes, this would be, if they include a lot of the different methods. Like, say I want to determine attitudes about campus food options but are concerned about possible differences in opinion between men and women. Each floor of a dorm is gender-based and there are 60% women and 40% men. So let's say I randomly choose 2 dorms out of, we're assuming, a lot more than 2. That would be cluster. Then I'm going to choose 6 women's floors and 4 men's floors, so then I'm going to stratify because that is 60% versus 40%. And then I'm going to use a computer to select 10 students from each floor, which is an SRS. So again, not used very often, but it is something that is out there. So here are a few scenarios for you to take a look at. What I would like you to do is press pause, try all 4 of the questions, just naming the sampling technique based on the ones we just talked about, and then press play to see how you did. So the first one, picking every 10th passenger, that one was a pretty straightforward one. That is systematic because we're picking every nth person. From the boarding list, we're randomly picking 5 from first class and 25 from the rest. I am to assume then that this is based on the percentages in the plane, and so I said stratified because obviously there are fewer first class seats than there are the rest of the seats. What if I randomly generate 30 seat numbers and survey the passengers who sit in those 30 seats? This would just be your SRS. I'm randomly selecting. I'm not taking into account, gender or looking at groups. I'm just straight up looking for 30 randomly selected people. And lastly, randomly select a seat position, window, center, aisle, and then talk to everybody who sits in that position. And this one should be cluster because we're choosing one of the categories and talking to everybody in that category.